a Northern Cheyenne Nation citizen, raised most of my life on my reservation. I'm located now in DC. As Chelsea said, I'm the Vice President of Tribal Health Programs here at NIHB. If you guys, anybody that's new to NIHB, welcome. So here at the National Indian Health Board, we serve all 575 federally recognized tribal nations. We support tribal health by building capacity and delivering national programming, training, technical assistance, policy, and partnerships that reflect priorities of tribal nations. Everything that we do is grounded in tribal sovereignty and guided and directed by tribal leaders. So before we begin, Chelsea and I just wanted to kind of center ourselves. We want to acknowledge that domestic violence takes many forms. It can be emotional, physical, psychological, financial, sexual, spiritual, or digital. And in many tribal communities, these experiences are also shaped by historical trauma, colonizations, and barriers to cultural safe services. At the same time, I don't want us today to only see and hear about the challenges and remember that across tribal nations, we see incredible strengths every day. We see culture, community, and traditional teachings that support our healing. We see survivors, families, advocates, and tribal leaders creating solutions that reflect the strengths of their own community. At NIHB, we believe that culture is medicine. Healing happens through connections, relationships, and community. And our goal is not only to respond to violence, but to help create communities where people feel safe, supported, and are able to thrive. So as we welcome our speakers today, I would invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you're from, what you do, have those kind of conversations within the chat so that we get to know each other. And hopefully through the next 2 days, we'll connect with one another, learn from each other, and leave with ideas that we can take back to our communities. I will love to have the two speakers to introduce themselves the way that they would like to. Your guys' bios, hopefully you've read the bios already. They're in the advertisement of the webinar. So I'll hand it off to you, Whitney.
Okay, we kind of had some technical difficulties starting, so I'm kind of like on my phone and my computer. So let me get myself set back up here. Sorry, guys, just taking me a second here. Okay. Share. Okay, how's that, Chelsea? Are we good? Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Whitney Nordvold, and I am a member of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. I'm a clinical social worker and qualified mental health professional. And I just want to start out by briefly introducing myself and helping you all get to know why this topic is so important to me. Like I said, I'm from Lower Brule and I grew up in Fort Pierre. I now live in Pierre. If you know anything about South Dakota, Pierre and Fort Pierre are just right across the river from each other. And Lower Brule is about an hour away. And I have an office in Pierre where I do individual trauma-informed care. And then I also travel to Lower Brule a couple days a week. And my work centers on trauma, domestic violence, and nervous system healing. So I do a lot of body-based trauma healing work. I do talk therapy, DBT, and CBT, which are more like behavioral type interventions. but I would say about half of my work is really about helping people feel their way through and onto the other side of really hard experiences. And this topic is really deeply important to me because I am a domestic violence survivor. I'm the daughter of a domestic violence survivor, and I have grandmothers that are domestic violence survivors. And as a result, those experiences, along with my clinical work, have really profoundly shaped how I do this work, how I relate to it, and create a passion in me that helps me want to interrupt the cycles of violence before another generation has to suffer from these experiences. And I hope today that I'm not just providing information or education. I want us to look at domestic violence through a different lens, one that helps us recognize the signs before violence, physical violence, is an indicator. So often when people think of it, they think of the proof that we can physically see. And today we're really going to focus a lot on the things that we can't physically see with our eyes, which are major indicators of a crisis coming down the line. And we're going to talk about how to respond to those things in a trauma-informed way. But before we dive in, Chelsea, if you want to launch that first one, I just want to know who's in the room. I'm just wondering, who am I talking to? Who am I sharing the space with? What role are you coming in with? A community member? Where are you at? What are you doing? Mm. Am I able to see? Oh, if I click the chat.
Yeah, and I'll share them. We have about 10% of participants responding. It's slowly
Okay.
going up. Yeah, we can leave it for a few more. There's a lot of conversation in the chat.
Yeah.
Folks are joining.
Yeah. I'd also like to note that I am just extremely honored and privileged to be able to share this information. And I'm so grateful for all of you that are here today, taking this time out of your very busy and important schedules. This is a topic that impacts all of us, whether we're aware of it or not. And so the fact that you are here taking your time to learn about it and create awareness in your personal life and in your communities is a huge testament to the value of the work that you do in your communities. So I just want to thank everybody for being here in this capacity.
Absolutely. We're almost at 50% of folks.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like we have nonprofits, we have domestic violence advocates, workforce development. We have some fellow MSWs in the room, public health professionals, school social worker. Thank you all for the work that you do.
Are you okay with me ending it? Looks like it's trickled down a little bit.
Yeah. I see some other South Dakota people here. Hey, thank you, everybody. Yeah, I just want to get a clear kind of idea of who I'm talking to so that I'm not patronizing anybody. All right. Okay. Thank you all for sharing so I have an idea of who I'm talking to. So, Chelsea already kind of noted, touched on this, but our focus is trauma-informed care, and one of the most important parts and pieces of being trauma informed is making sure that we're creating safety. Trauma informed care begins with safety. And so I want to make sure that everybody is feeling safe themselves. So we're going to be talking about domestic violence, coercive control, trauma, historical trauma, loss, and grief. And those are all very heavy topics. So if you need to step away, like Chelsea said, move around, get some water, take your shoes off and feel the floor. Just participate at whatever level feels comfortable and safe for you. All right. So we'll just kind of dive in here. I can't remember, Chelsea. Is this where I'm supposed to do the next one?
Yeah, we can do the next one.
Yeah, I feel like this is a good one. So I'm wondering, like, what words or phrases come to mind when you hear the phrase domestic violence? Like, just put a word or two in the chat that comes to your mind that you think of when you hear domestic violence. Scared, fear, control, ownership. Is that my friend Tess? My friend Tess is here. Abuse, fear, pain, sadness. Yeah. So when most people think about domestic violence, they think of physical violence. Like that's kind of the main way that people refer to it, generally speaking. It sounds like we have some really well-informed people here today, and you guys get it. Desperation. That's another really clear one. Yeah. So a lot of people think about bruises, black eyes, police reports. But research over the last couple of decades has really challenged the way that we need to be talking about abuse. Sociologist Evan Stark sort of trademarked the concept of coercive control, and that's going to be sort of the focus of what we're going to talk about today. And coercive control, Evan Stark is a sociologist, and his way of describing it is a pattern of behavior that is designed to take away another person's freedom, dominate the other person, restrict their freedom, their independence, and their ability to make decisions about their own life. So at its core, many of you said control. At its core, coercive control is about power and control, and it's about gradually shrinking the victim's world so that the abusive partner, becomes the center of it. And so instead of asking, like, where's the evidence? Have you ever been hit? Have you ever been slapped? Have you ever been, assaulted? Instead of asking, were they hit? The better question, the trauma-informed question, the upstream question before we get to crisis is, are they free? Are they allowed to decide where they can go? Are they allowed to spend time with family and friends? Can they manage their own money? Are they allowed to practice their chosen culture or spirituality? Are they allowed to make decisions without the fear of consequences? Can they trust their own thoughts and feelings? These are the questions that we need to ask if we're going to be getting ahead of crisis. So why would we focus on coercive control? Why is this topic important when we're talking about domestic violence? And some of the reasons are because we know now that it's one of the strongest predictors and indicators of intimate partner homicide. And most of that research has been done on femicide. So primarily male partners taking the life of their female partner. But I want to make it really, really clear throughout this entire presentation that this is not a gender issue, that domestic violence, coercive control, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse can go both ways. The victim can be male or female, the perpetrator can be male or female. So I just want to make sure that we're talking about it in an inclusive and realistic way. So coercive control often precedes physical and sexual violence. It often begins months or years before crisis. And when we say crisis, we're talking about physical abuse and sexual abuse as it's defined criminally. It creates opportunities for earlier intervention if we are aware of what coercive control is and what to look for and how to safely and appropriately respond when we see it. So if we wait for physical violence, that means that we've probably missed many of the warning signs. Now, that's not to say that physical violence or crisis doesn't happen, you know, without coercive control. We're just talking about in general public patterns here and what the research says. So what is coercive control? We look at it a little bit deeper. One of the biggest misconceptions about domestic violence is that it's about anger or it's about isolated acts of violence. And research tells us something totally different. Coercive control is creating a life where where the victim's life is smaller and smaller over time. It's not really about like getting someone to do what we want today. It's about making the victim dependent on the abuser. Now, let's think about the areas that make us independent as human beings. We need freedom to make decisions, to maintain relationships, manage our own finances, to be an individual, like to really be ourselves. And coercive control slowly chips away at those things until the survivor begins organizing their life around not what do I want, who do I want to be, what kind of life do I want, and more about what do I need to do to like keep the peace? What do I need to do to manage how this person's going to respond to me? So instead of asking, what do I want, they might be operating from a place of how can I keep my partner from being upset with me or frustrated or disappointed in me? So we'll just look at each of these areas. So time could be, insisting on knowing where the partner, the victim is at all times, criticizing how you spend your free time, becoming angry or acting jealous whenever the partner is with a family member or a friend or anybody who's not the abuser past a certain amount of schedule of the victim revolves around whatever pleases the abuser. So movement is similar. It's like, where are you going? Who are you with? Text me when you get there. Now we live in this digital world where somebody can have access to your location at any given time. So, are they monitoring your location through Life 360 or something like that? And I also want to, we're talking about the context of primarily intimate partner relationships, but coercive control can be in a parent-child relationship. It can be in a friendship. These are all things that can exist outside of a romantic relationship. And often, whenever it exists in a romantic relationship, that means that whoever is engaging in this behavior probably was a victim of it by their parents or witnessed their parents experience the same thing. Or it can be in a workplace. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So when we talk about what is coercive control financially, so that's access to employment, like whether or not you're allowed to have a job. Are you made to feel like you're a bad parent because you're abandoning your kids to work? Do you have access to your own bank accounts or any finances? Do you have access to education or transportation? Are you allowed to make choices with your own money, or do you have access to it? relationships. So isolation rarely starts with like, you're not allowed to be around your family anymore or something like that. It usually starts with little criticisms about like, oh, I don't think your mom likes me, or that friend of yours is a bad influence. And I'm not talking about when that's true. I'm talking about when that's a manipulation tactic. It just becomes easier for the victim to not spend time with their family or their friends or people who are not the abuser because they have to answer to it every time they do. Here is the really hard one: thoughts and reality. So, through gaslighting, manipulation, constant criticism, this can erode confidence and self trust. And I want us to stop at gaslighting for just a second because it has become sort of a buzzword in our culture, it seems. And a lot of people use that phrase, but I know from experience in therapy that less people know what it actually is than the people who use it, if that makes sense. And so gaslighting actually comes from a play that was written in the late 1930s and became a movie in the 1940s. And in this play, there's a man, a husband, who at the time there wasn't electricity, so they had gas lights all over their house, and he went through and turned all of them down a little tiny bit every single day. And he was trying to convince his wife that she was losing her mind by lying to her and saying that it wasn't getting darker when it actually was. And his goal was to make her go crazy so that he could steal her inheritance. But so that's where the term gaslighting comes from in the first place. But gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse. It's a psychological manipulation, and the goal is to gain power by forcing the victim to rely on the abuser's version of reality. So the phrases that indicate gaslighting are endless, but it can be like, you're overreacting, that never happened, I was just joking, that's not how I saw it. Or it can be like, I didn't mean it that way, therefore it doesn't count. The pain that you're experiencing isn't real because I didn't mean to hurt you. So I really wanted to make that part really clear because I feel like gaslighting is one that gets kind of thrown around a little bit. So body. This is one where we're talking about, this is further downstream, this is crisis. But there are other ways that coercive control exists outside of physical violence. And that can be by manipulating or attacking somebody's appearance, their reproductive decisions, their access to healthcare, how much they sleep, how much they eat. This can be attacking the way somebody looks, making them dress a certain way. And then the last on this list is identity. And I feel like this is probably maybe the greatest loss that comes with coercive control and abuse in this way. And the attack on the identity is when people don't know who they are anymore and they can't trust themselves anymore. And they have so much dysregulation in their body that they're just constantly on alert, and they just aren't themselves. They're not allowed to maybe practice their spiritual convictions. Maybe their cultural identity is attacked, just their sense of self. Now, none of these, with the exception of, maybe sexual or physical abuse, are creating a bruise or something that you can physically see on somebody, I guess, unless we did like a brain scan before and after. I think somebody's unmuted, Chelsea. So the question that I want to pose to everybody to just kind of keep in mind that I'd like you to sort of take away from part of our conversation today is, what do survivors lose that people can't see? So oftentimes, whenever we're talking about abuse, we're talking about a physical symptom, something that we can see and prove. That's, in order to make it a criminal offense, we have to have proof. Thankfully, in many legal systems, that is changing, and coercive control is becoming a more common documentable abuse. But I think that's my next question. People can put it in the chat if they want to, or Chelsea, if you want to launch that. What do survivors lose that people can't see? And this is why it matters so much that we talk about it. Sense of self, personal autonomy, confidence, self-esteem, trust in self and others. Yeah. Emotional autonomy. Dignity. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, dignity. Sometimes respect from others. Wow, that's a good one, because people often see victims as less than, or they did it to themselves, or they were an active participant in it. Yeah. Thank you. Their voice. All right. Thank you, guys. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. So coercive control is extremely effective because it doesn't just change someone's circumstances, it also changes the way they experience the world in lots of ways. When we look at how the brain changes, it increases hypervigilance, it increases self-doubt, and it impacts somebody's difficulty. It impacts somebody's ability to make decisions. So when my character and my opinion and my, every thought that I have is questioned, I begin to question myself. And we are constantly scanning for danger. We call that hypervigilance, and it might not necessarily be physical danger, but we are constantly scanning for whether or not the person in front of us is pleased with us or not, whether or not that important relationship is being attacked or not. People who experience this kind of abuse as children and as romantic partners often become very, very good at noticing tone of voice, anticipating moods, and so on. It often comes with irritability too. That's a really major symptom of
Trying to replace this,
hypervigilance.
but it doesn't look like you guys have it on your shelf.
What size is it?
Sorry, I was distracted by that. So the body, chronic stress, fatigue, sleep problems, physical symptoms. A lot of people experience even at some point their immune system is so impacted that they may experience a autoimmune condition. Your immune system is impacted by lack of sleep and increase in stress. And so when your hormones are out of whack because you're always experiencing cortisol spikes and adrenaline spikes because of stress, it can cause all these downstream health issues. The self, we just talked about that. Identity, confidence, intuition, and hope can be impacted. And obviously relationships. We get cut off as the victim from the rest of our world that made us us before the abuse existed. So one thing I just have a couple slides left before I hand it over to Shelby, but one thing I really want to make sure that we don't skip over is when we're talking about coercive control and we're talking about domestic violence, we spend a lot of time focusing on the victim and how do we help the victim and how do we get the victim back on track. And that's so important. But I wonder, you know, how many people are thinking, what kind of person would do these things? And I've worked on both sides. I've worked with people who are, you know, fall in that abuser category, and I've worked with people who fall in that victim category. And very few people are born intending to harm others. There's lots of people who have become abusive because of their own histories, trauma, neglect, violence, unhealthy relationship models. And I just want to note that if we're looking for a long-term solution, then that doesn't just mean that we have to support and help survivors. That means that we have to prevent abusers from becoming abusers. So this is a system-wide issue, and that's what we're going to talk more about next time. But I just want to throw out there that the victim and the abuser are both in pain when these kinds of things happen. And we don't want to ignore the fact that somebody who is abusive also needs to be rehabilitated, and that we need to create families, communities, and systems where abuse is not tolerated and it's not normalized, and it's not an intergenerational thing anymore. So I'm not saying this as an excuse, but I am saying it just as an awareness that, you know, the people who are these abusers or engage in these abusive behaviors are our brothers and our sisters and our aunties and our dads and our uncles and our grandpas. They're our family members just as much as the victims are as well. Okay. So I want to just take a quick second to note how coercive control might look a little bit different in Native communities. Abusive people tend to weaponize whatever is most important to the person that they are trying to control. And in Indian country, that might look like questioning someone's identity by using blood quantum or lateral violence or stereotypes. So if we have a Native victim and a non-Native partner, they might use, they might use stereotypes to shame the person in front of them. If somebody like me who's white presenting, might be attacked for being a white girl and because I don't look a certain way, or somebody who's dark, has darker skin might be attacked because they have darker skin or they have a higher blood quantum, or somebody who grew up off res might be accused of being not Native enough or not counting as their cultural identity doesn't count because they are, I'm sure you could all think of endless numbers of these ways that this happens. Another is preventing or forcing participation in ceremony or cultural practices. So, say somebody and they're dating somebody who grew up, participating in ceremony. And so they may force them to participate in ceremony or force them to go to church with them or vice versa, or whatever their spiritual practices are, or attack their character because of the cultural or spiritual convictions that they have. And this can happen in non-Native communities, but I have seen it happen over and over again, where this sort of colonized division is we perpetrate against each other through this colonized framework, I guess, division that was created, over generations. Misusing traditional teachings or spiritual beliefs to justify control, not to bring up, well, I won't bring it up. I'll just say we all, are aware of some of the situations that have been in the news in the last year, and have seen people use traditional spiritual teachings unethically and quite disgustingly in order to gain power over their victims. Close-knit community relationships, or fear of community repercussions. And, you know, Shelby and I were talking a little bit before this, and she'll talk a little bit more about this, but there is this strong, overwhelming value in Native communities that family is number one, that we have to stick together. And when somebody is getting out so that they can save themselves or their children, they may be afraid of community repercussions or relationships being lost. So none of this historical trauma, sort of generational colonization, those words that I'm using are excuses. Culture is one of our greatest protective factors, but it is something that we need to, you know, keep in mind while we're working through this, just so we can see it as a whole in context and reality. Okay, so I want to give everybody an idea of what, you know, some things that we can do. And before I talk about this, I want to note that I did send Chelsea a couple of resources. One of them is just like the key takeaways from this, since I didn't share my slides, but there's a handout. They don't have access to it yet, right, Chelsea?
No, I'm adding them to the chat now.
Okay, great. So it's just this 2-page, just a little 2-pager, and it talks about what does coercive control look like, and then some trauma-informed responses or questions that you can ask, things that survivors might say, or, you know, just some signs or symptoms to keep an eye on if you're interacting with people. You know, if you are a domestic violence advocate or a mental health professional, often people are coming to you and they're outing these experiences right to you. Not all the time, but sometimes. But if you're working as, you know, a medical professional, or you're working as a community member, or, you know, you're working in the legal system, somebody's not necessarily going to come to you and say, hey, I need help so I can get out of this, or so I can do this thing, or, you know, I need support in this way. So now that we know what coercive control looks like, we have a responsibility to respond differently. As Indigenous people and people working in Indigenous communities, we have a expectation that we're going to take care of each other if we are living and interacting with our community members in alignment with traditional values for most communities. And that means for an individual, we can use this information to recognize unhealthy patterns, believe survivors, model healthy relationships, and challenge harmful beliefs and norms. And we'll talk more about this, kind of what this actually looks like tomorrow in tomorrow's webinar. For professionals, it might mean noticing patterns, not just incidents, asking trauma-informed questions like, thank you for trusting me with your story. What made you feel safer staying than leaving, instead of why didn't you leave? You know, that's just one example that's on this form. Asking questions that make sure that the person you're interacting with feels safe. Increasing safety, dignity, and choice, and knowing your referral resources. This is something that it would be good for all of you to know, whether you're here personally or you're here professionally. And as community members, we need to stop normalizing coercive control. We need to stop saying, oh, that's just how he is, that's just how she is. And we need to stop turning a blind eye to inappropriate behaviors and patterns. Rewarding and supporting healthy relationships, holding harmful behavior accountable, and creating communities where asking for help is safe. So these are just kind of some basics, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like tomorrow. So recognizing coercive control is the first step. And then the next step would be responding with safety, dignity, and hope so that we can create healing. Let's see, is there anything else? So yeah, I'm gonna hand this over to Shelby. And she's gonna talk about, what does it look like when somebody takes those first steps or is, curious with her organization or somebody like her organization about the steps of getting out of a relationship like this.
Great. Thank you, Whitney. And hello, everybody. I am so incredibly happy to see so many participants today. I think it's so incredibly important to have conversations like this in a safe space and to also just really continue that education when you're in fields where you're dealing with survivors of domestic violence and in turn creating a safe community for them. So my name is Shelby Bergeson. I am the executive director of Missouri Shores Domestic Violence Center that's located in Pierre, South Dakota. I have been with the organization for 7 years and in February stepped into this executive director position. Outside of that, I've done a lot of work with public policy and trying to create some change on higher levels. And through that, I've been able to meet so many different people that come from different walks of life and been able to learn from them. And I'm really hoping that I can share my knowledge and it will benefit you and the work that you do as we talk today. So like Whitney said, we visited yesterday a little bit about just some of the things that come up for survivors when they're trying to leave. And she touches base on those different aspects. My goal is to help you kind of understand what that process looks like from a survivor standpoint. I myself am a survivor of domestic violence, and I never visited a shelter. I didn't even know our shelter existed. I had PD coming to my house on a weekly basis, and they never told me about Missouri Shores. And so part of what I like to really drive in is that the community really is such an important resource for survivors, and kind of having an idea of what a survivor might be stepping into so that you can share that information with them and maybe help give them a chance to sit with that and then make that informed decision on what they want to do next, whether that be go to a shelter, find a family member, a friend, someplace safe they can go. So something important to note is that shelters aren't necessarily just there to provide shelter. What we hear a lot about when people come and visit us is they think that if they come to have a conversation, they automatically have to check in. They're going to come in and they're going to visit with an advocate, and the advocate is going to say, hey, I understand you've been through some really difficult things. Here's the shelter. Let's get you checked in. And then all of a sudden, they're losing their autonomy again. They're not able to make their decisions. They're being told they need to get checked in. And that's not the case at all. There are so many different services that shelters can provide outside of just shelter. And a lot of that just starts with a simple conversation. So one of the biggest things that we see is we have community members that bring in survivors. So it might be a counselor that has a client that says, hey, this is what I'm going through. And they just had to tell their story to their counselor and give all this information that they've probably never told anybody before. And then a counselor says, let's get you to a domestic violence shelter and talk about options. That can be extremely overwhelming. And so something that we really advocate for at our shelter, especially, is have the counselor come in. We can go to the counselors and sit down and start to have those conversations of, hey, thank you so much for sharing your story. What can we do to support you? What are the next steps that look the best for you? We're not there to push our opinions or what we think they should do next onto anybody. We want to make sure that we are supporting every decision that that person makes, right? So as community members, as I saw so many different professions that have come in today, that is something to know, is to reach out to those local shelters. All shelters operate a little bit differently. But if you feel that it might be a good option to reach out to your shelter and say, hey, I just want to know kind of what you're about. I want to know what it would look like if I had somebody that needed to come into a shelter. What would that look like with you, and what would that process be? I think that being able to kind of erase some of those unknowns and provide a little bit of guidance really helps survivors when they're ready to take that next step. I know that personally for me, I would not have gone to the shelter because I would have been scared. I would have been scared that maybe the people there would automatically put me into a box and say, here's another Native American woman that is being battered. Now, is that the experience I would have had now that I know the people who work at the shelter that I'm at? Absolutely not. But as Native Americans, we deal with a lot of preconceived notions and we get put into a box, which is extremely unfortunate. But with survivors, we do hear that a lot when they come through our doors, is they're scared to come in because they don't want to be judged. They've spent their entire lives being judged. They've spent the last 6 years that they've been with an abuser being told who they are and what is wrong with them and what's going to happen when they ask for help. So our job is really to make sure that they feel supported, that they feel heard, that they come in and they are met without any kind of judgment. And a lot of different places are going to be very culturally aware of that. Now, I would also offer up that if you are in an area where you don't know much about your domestic violence shelter, I would say reach out always, and also reach out and see if they might need any guidance in that. When I started, I was the only Native American employee out of the four of us that work here. So I want to make sure that we were all still in kind of line. You know, we do have policies and procedures and shelters. We have a curfew for safety purposes. But when somebody would come over and say, hey, I would like to be able to go to a sweat over the weekend, I'm sitting there and of course saying, absolutely go. This is needed for your healing journey. Absolutely. But I wanted to make sure that was in line with everybody else in the office and that I wasn't making an exception that they considered not necessary. Everybody I worked with said, absolutely, that's necessary for your healing journey. So education for advocates, education for anybody who's providing those services is extremely important. And if you are in the capacity to be able to say, hey, can we sit down and have some conversations about what healing might look like for the survivor who's coming in, that might be a really great way to make sure that there's not going to be miscommunication and it's not maybe going to set that survivor off of, I don't think I want to try shelters. Because one negative interaction can really impact their healing journey and how they move forward. So for shelters, like I said, we can do a lot of different things. If a person comes in, we can start with doing something simple as a safety assessment and planning. So we're going to assess that immediate risk, see if that survivor it needs to be checked in immediately, or do we just develop a safety plan that's personalized to their needs? What situation are we preparing for? Is it you're filing a protection order and you want to know what that process looks like and what safety might look like in that situation? Or are you getting ready to leave and you need to know what kind of documents you have? You need to know how to set aside money safely. All of those are different things that we can do without somebody even checking in. And that can be done over a period of time. That doesn't have to be coming in the door and within 5 minutes we're putting together safety plans. Everything is always going to be at the speed that that survivor needs to be able to kind of take in what's happening. I had somebody come in and she was filing a protection order against her husband. And she sat down with me and we started working through the process and we talked about the protection order. We talked about safety planning. We talked about resources. And at the end, I had some paperwork for her to sign off on, and I had written down, this is what she explained happened for my records, and it had the word abuse on there. And she said, I'm being abused. I don't think I'm being abused. So a lot of times when people come through our doors, they don't even necessarily know what's going on. They don't have the education, the advocates or therapists or health professionals they have. So our job is to not only provide that kind of immediate crisis intervention, that emotional support and that validation, sometimes it's providing education and saying, this is what's happening to you. It's coercive control. It's taking over your autonomy. This is what we can do to help you. And it is so, so incredibly difficult sometimes as advocates to have those conversations and see that realization and then help them work through it. But at the end of the day, it is equally as rewarding because when they are able to put a name to what is happening to them, that is when they are able to start moving forward in their process of healing. We also work with resource coordination, so really creating some of those early connections to reduce barriers for clients so we can connect them with childcare, housing, and really work through what their needs are to be able to connect them, to be able to get them a community. It's truly about not only community help and community resources, but building communities around these survivors. They cannot thrive if they continue to be isolated without resources and support. And so our goal is always to create community for them, whether that's setting them up with a counselor that can be a long-term solution for them as they work through their trauma, whether it's setting them up with applications for Head Start so that they can have their child enrolled and they can make connections with other parents and with teachers. We really just strive to be able to help that portion of their healing journey. One of the things that I wanted to touch base on is that collaboration part for advocates in shelters. Something that we don't talk a lot about sometimes is what collaboration looks like, especially when we have Native American clients who come in and maybe need to file a protection order or they need to talk to law enforcement. Native American victims typically have different barriers than other races. And again, we hear it when clients come in and say, I don't want them to stereotype me. I don't want them to think that I'm just another person that's coming through and I'm going to go right back to my abuser. And we've had issues like that come up, unfortunately. Pierre being the capital, you'd think it would be a little bit more diverse. Unfortunately, it's not as diverse as one might think. And what tends to happen is Pierre catches all of our reservations, so where we're centrally located. So while we serve Pierre, we also serve a lot of reservations. And it's the central hub for people to come in because we have job opportunities. It's getting away from their abuser on the reservation. They're able to come in and just start over, which is kind of our goal. We want them to be able to start over and start anew while also maintaining what they need from, we like to say, your past life, right? Because it's their past life. They're now in this new stage where they're healing and they're thriving. But a lot of times that might include they need a temporary protection order. They might need to make a police report. Sometimes they need to go down to the hospital and be checked out to make sure they're medically okay. And that collaboration from our shelter advocates with those professionals is a huge piece of being able to help that survivor move forward because we're able to step in and help advocate for them. If we have an officer who is looking at somebody with judgment, an advocate can step in and essentially tell them, we need you to either be compassionate and non-judgmental, or we need another officer to come in, which is a conversation that can be difficult to have, but it's something that we have honestly pretty frequently sometimes. And again, back to what Whitney had said, it's not just women. We have had men who have been sexually assaulted that we need to collaborate with officers and a SANE examiner to be able to get those things done. And sometimes there is judgment because they're a male, and why aren't they pushing them off? Why aren't they stopping them when they're the male? And at that point, the advocates can step in and help educate and help redirect to making sure that those services are being done in a non-judgmental light. So just a few of those things are things that we can do before a client even checks into our shelter. And those are things that a lot of people don't know are there. So again, just really driving in that, please reach out to your local resources and get an idea of what they're able to help with. Because that survivor may not be ready to step into a shelter and spend the night or spend 30 days to try and get things going, or a couple months, but they might be ready to take that initial step and be introduced to what a shelter looks like and what services can be offered. That first step sometimes is just knowing. With shelters, so with our check-in process, something that's important for survivors to know is that we do need to know some of the details for them to check in. And that's just because we need to have an idea of what kind of services to provide. We want to make sure they fit services. We want to make sure that we have all the information so we can give referrals if we need to for mental health, if there's any substance abuse, because unfortunately, substances are a huge coping mechanism for a lot of survivors. We want to know how to connect people to what they need when the time comes. And I think a lot of times victims may not know that. They're coming out of a crisis situation. They jump into a shelter, and now all of a sudden they have to re-explain everything that happened. For us personally at our shelter, we try and keep it bare minimum. If it is traumatizing for you to have to retell all of that, if you just told your counselor who referred you to us, I don't want to put you through more re-traumatization. I want you to tell me what you're comfortable telling me when you're comfortable telling me. So we do go through that process, and we do have policies for safety that those victims sign off on and say, hey, we're checking in. When they get in, we're able to set them up in a room. We provide everything. So we provide hygiene, we provide food, we provide funding if they need important documents. So birth certificates, if they lost their identification cards, any of those things, we can help provide the financial support for that. A lot of times when we have women come in, and men, because we do, our shelter serves both, when they come in, they're thinking, I don't have my birth certificate, I don't have my identification, I'm not going to be able to be checked in. For us, that's not an issue. We'll help you get those documents. A lot of times, the abuser will keep documents from a survivor because that's their way out, and that's how they can go and recover, begin their new life. They're going to be able to get their apartments. They're going to be able to get jobs because they have their documents. And unfortunately, abusers kind of thrive on that control, so they'll take them away. We can help with that. We can help with transportation. Basically, anything that a survivor needs financial flow for. You know that financial abuse is very prominent with people. It's a huge means of control. We can help with that so that you can get away safely, and then you don't have to worry about as much. We can take some of the weight that might be on your shoulders by helping financially. And it's important to note that coming to shelter is a significant transition. It's a significant transition physically by having to remove all your items from your home and bringing it into the shelter. It's also a significant transition emotionally, because that survivor is going to be feeling so many different emotions. It could be relief. They could be feeling fear and anxiety, loss and grief. They could be having trauma responses with flashbacks, that hypervigilance, all of those different things. And sometimes they could be feeling it all at once. And so for us, we like to give our survivors time to acclimate. a lot of shelters are short-term stays because they're considered emergency shelters. So sometimes I think a big misconception is you go into a shelter and you immediately have to get started. We have to get housing figured out. We have to get job figured out. What about daycare? We need to get all these things done. And that is overwhelming. It's overwhelming for me as a mom to figure out my kids' sports schedules without the added trauma of getting out of an abusive relationship. So you can only imagine what it's like for these survivors starting brand new with nothing, sometimes with nothing but the clothes on their back, and trying to navigate a new town, a new place to live. A lot of shelters are community spaces, so they have their own rooms, but they have community kitchens and community living rooms. So now you're trying to navigate this while you have 5 other families who are also navigating it. And so giving adequate time to settle in is something that's really important. We want to make sure that we are able to cater to their emotional needs, and what that looks like for each person is a little bit different. So once we get into that, we do some case management. We will work through what their needs are, their immediate needs. So whether it's those important documents, whether it's clothing items, if they have children who need to get enrolled in school, what does transportation look like? We'll walk through all of that step by step with the client. And during that time, we will also look at what their spiritual needs are. And that is something that is incredibly important, because you can get somebody, a birth certificate, but that doesn't help heal what's going on internally. And so being aware of their culture, being aware of what's important to them and what can help bring them some peace is incredibly important. That means that we can help them find an elder in the community that they can talk to and go to, and make some connections there. It might mean that we're able to give them permission to leave for weekends for sweats. It might mean that we get them connected to our Lakoa Chapel Church here in town. Whatever that looks like, we try and make sure that we are catering to those spiritual needs and making sure that they have what they need to be able to move forward. So I think biggest things are always going to be know your local resources. We have community resources that call up to us all the time to ask what we can do and what those services look like in that process. And I'm very grateful to be in the shelter that I am at. I am very grateful that we are open door policy. We have survivors just come down whenever they want, and they'll visit for an hour, they'll visit for 10 minutes, whatever their needs are, we can meet those. However, I can't speak for all of the different shelters that might be in your areas. And so again, I would heavily advise just reaching out and making a connection, and then maybe helping set something up. I have been able to go into some different counseling offices and talk to the counselors and just say, hey, here's Missouri Shores, here's what we can offer. If you ever need me to come in, I can make an appearance, just so they can put a face to the name. But maybe opening the door into some of that. And again, then you can ask some of those questions. What does your shelter do to accommodate spiritual and cultural needs and those differences? And then if their answer is, we don't really know, then we can jump into, can I help you make a connection so that we can do this the best way for each survivor as they move forward? Those connections are incredibly important. And I can guarantee you, anybody in this line of work wants to do the best that they can for survivors. That's why we're here. That's what we're put here to do. I truly believe that anybody in this line of work just feels that call to serve in their soul. And I have not met anybody in this line of work that works with victims of domestic violence that has any kind of ill intention when it comes to providing services. So ask questions, never be afraid to talk to that shelter nearest you and say, what can we do? And if you have any questions for me, my contact information is there on the screen, and I will hand it back over.
Are you handing it back to me? Am I taking it? Okay.
Say whoever's
Um,
taking it next.
Yeah, so I just had like one kind of final question that I wanted to pose before Shelby and I are available to answer any of your questions. Um, I just kind of wanted to share sort of my takeaway of what you just said, Shelby, that anybody can apply. The importance is to empower the individual and help them restore voice, choice, and power. And I think that doing that individually for every person, so asking them, you know, what do they think they need? We don't want to make any assumptions about what their spiritual needs are or what their, maybe that means we have to give them a choice because they're too overwhelmed by, what's going on in their life to say, I need this, I need this, I need this, but giving them choice and restoring that voice as best we can in whatever capacity we're interacting with them. So thank you for all the work that you do, Shelby. And thank you for your comments. And yeah, so go ahead and share that last question that I wanted to share, Chelsea. I just want to make sure that everybody can kind of ground themselves in a takeaway, even if it feels like it's small, one word, one sentence. What's one thing you'll do differently with the knowledge that you learned here today? Again, it can be a word, it can be a sentence, a phrase. And be more open and meet people where they're at. That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that too, Shelby. I did access services at Missouri Shores. I never stayed in the shelter, but I did receive services, and I'm really grateful for how I was met during my time there. And Pierre is very blessed and lucky to have the shelter that we have. Ensure I'm allowing people to have autonomy over their life and decisions when they ask for help instead of immediately going to problem solving. Such a great reflection, Kaylin. Thank you. Provide more information on resources. Okay. Well, I just want to finish by saying, Wopila, thank you for your time and attention, and any questions that you have, me and Shelby will try to answer them if we can.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Shelby. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I'm going to let some love be shared with all the hearts and the thank yous in the chat. So one of the first questions that came in from, I would call Candy a good friend, colleague. Candy Cornelius has a question. I sat on the MMRT, the Maternal Mortality Review Team, and was surprised at how many cases involve domestic violence. There needs to be changes at the police level. How do we help with that?
I have opinions. I don't know that I have any clear solutions, but I know Shelby has done a little bit more advocacy at that level, it sounds like, than I have. But I think from, a social work perspective, if you feel called to get involved on a policy level, meet with leaders, hold when you have any interactions, respectfully hold law enforcement accountable. Like Shelby said, if they're being disrespectful, if they're being non-compassionate, call it out for what it is. But I think that doing what we're doing today is a huge opportunity to educate people. If you see something like this, share it with a leader in your community that impacts law enforcement. That's just from like a grassroots community level. Shelby might have a better response to that than I do.
That is a great start, is to just conversation, starting a conversation with people at that level. So finding out who your representatives are in the area. A big thing is finding out what committees they serve on, and then looking into maybe what bills might be coming up that you could speak on. So a big part, so we have in South Dakota, it's the South Dakota Network Against Family Violence and Sexual Assault, and they have a lobbyist because I have to be incredibly careful in my position, which I'm sure a lot of you also have to do, to not lobby. And so kind of starting out knowing the difference between lobbying and also advocating is going to be a huge piece of that, in getting some of that education on what those different, what constitutes each. I would also say getting in touch with them and then getting other people involved, setting some meetings. If it's police officers that you're worried about and you're saying, hey, there's some major concerns here and we're wanting to speak up about it, get in touch with your local police department and see if you can talk to a captain and just say, hey, I'm just wondering about this. I'd like to have a conversation. Can I set a time to meet? And then being very persistent and making sure that it's an in-person meeting. I find in-person meetings typically have a bigger impact than an email. So starting at those levels and then reaching out to larger organizations. So Futures Without Violence is one that I have done some policy work with. I've talked to Health and Human Services with Futures Without Violence, and they do an excellent job of being able to kind of take some issues and then taking it to a higher level. So it doesn't necessarily have to be you doing that. If you can find support systems in this field that have a larger reach, and maybe are a little bit more familiar with policy and law and what that might look like, that's a really great resource to reach out and start with, just so you have an idea of what those next steps could be, and then continuing to move forward from there. But absolutely using your voice and reaching out is that first step.
Thank you, Shelby. Another question that we have in the chat, Natalie Adams asks, what are some ideas and ways to support survivors involved in child welfare systems that are consistently perpetuate harm, particularly against tribal communities, while understanding and navigating the child welfare system as choice looks different? It's a
Okay.
heavy hitter question.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I wanna can we maybe try to summarize it a little bit? There's like several questions there, and I have an immediate kind of thought of how to respond.
Why don't we approach it as ideas and ways to support survivors that are involved in those child welfare systems,
Yeah.
that are involved in tribal communities? Let's start there.
Yeah, okay. So working in Lower Brule, I would say I work with a lot, for whatever reason, I have a high amount of like adolescent and teen girls in on my caseload. From not just, my office is in Lower Brule, but I have people that come from Oklahoma, Chamberlain, Fort Thompson, Presho, all because that's kind of in the center there. So those are all little border towns around the reservation. And I would say at least a third of them are either in the system or have been, or are in a safety plan type situation. And in most of them, the parent has experienced, one of the parents or both of the parents are victims of abuse. So I'm assuming that this is the kind of situation that you're describing. And in this situation, and I think in what Shelby's talking about with advocacy and what we're talking about in this whole, in order to be trauma informed, we need to stay curious and we need to stay non-defensive as much as possible. So these are the response, really, I think, to what the question Shelby was answering and this question is create connections, create relationships with the people who have influence over these situations. If you are somebody who is a provider or a professional in that community, and you see something wrong, connect with and build relationships and connections with the people who have influence over those situations. So like for me, we only have a handful of DSS case managers that work the two reservations that are closest to where I live, so Lower Brule and Fort Thompson. But they also have kids in Chamberlain or families in Chamberlain and Pierre, which are all within like an hour and a half of each other. So I make it my business to know who these people are, make sure I get a chance to meet them, make sure they have my business card. And I think that that's, you know, the case with police officers. And, you know, there's another question in the chat about attorneys. So building relationships with those people outside of crisis, outside of a moment where you're defending or protecting somebody, allows you to kind of have your foot in the door when you do need to bring up something that's a little bit more controversial, I guess maybe is the word to use. Shelby, do you have anything you want to add to that? Or I hope that answers the question or gives, you know, some idea.
Yeah, I would just always advise to lean on others who are also experiencing the same frustration. It can be a lot to take on for one person, and I can guarantee you that there's probably other people in your community or in your organizations that you work with together that have experienced the same frustrations with the systems that are in place when it comes to working with domestic violence survivors, because there is a lack of understanding about domestic violence as a whole. But if you can find others in your community and kind of rally together and get together in a little group, have a lunch and say, here's where I'm noticing gaps. And here's where I'm noticing gaps. And we can put this information together. And now we can move forward as a group and say, here's me, here's this person, here's another, because sometimes numbers help, right? If you have multiple people coming forward and helping share the burden of the frustration and saying, this is what's going on, here are the gaps, here's how we think that we could find a solution together. Sometimes that carries a little bit more weight. So I would just advise, if there's kind of a round table that you can do that at with other professionals, I think that's a really great way to get things started. As I did see the question with the attorneys, how do we get them more education? Again, if you could get a roundtable of a few people together that say, hey, there's a training that Whitney is doing and it's about, you know, coercive control. We would love to see you get on there because we're noticing that there are gaps when it comes to serving survivors. Is this something that we could work together on? That can create a lot more conversation and more communication and hopefully some more action from different organizations and different people who maybe are not quite fully understanding what these things look like for survivors.
Thank you, Shelby and Whitney. We have a time for a couple more, I think. Hopefully I can sneak in one of my own questions at the end. We'll see. But one in the chat says, how do we educate divorce attorneys and family law attorneys on coercion and domestic violence?
Yeah, so Shelby just noted there at the end, you know, like make sure that you just stay connected. For me, because I do work with a kind of, I don't know if I'd say specialized, that feels kind of a stretch, but I work with a lot of women who have complex trauma as a result of their childhood and as a result of abuse, narcissistic abuse, that kind of thing. That's, you know, a common theme that I work with. And as a result, I have, you know, connected with family attorneys locally. So if you know of somebody who, you know, is an ally in this area or an advocate in this area, I would recommend trying to make connections between those allies who are, you know, professionals, or that this is kind of their jam, is to work in this world, and connect them with those attorneys. You know, give give one of these flyers. You can print off as many as you want, and share them with local attorneys. I think that it's it it's something that we all have to do together because it is a system issue. And so I guess I feel like I'm a broken record, but just make connections, talk about it. Don't be afraid to have uncomfortable conversations with people, I guess, is just kind of gonna be my response.
Thanks, Whitney. And there is a comment, not a direct question, but I think it's important to always talk about when you're thinking about sustainability and how these resources come in to support these survivors. And maybe it's going to be discussed tomorrow, but we have a participant that said, I just always wonder about funding and how to support. So I'm wondering if either one of you have anything to add around that. It's a big topic.
I can take that one. Funding is a huge topic, especially right now, with the current state of the administration. Different cuts have been made. Funding is extremely difficult. With federal dollars, it's always unknown. And so if you're looking for different resources when it comes to funding, we were just having this conversation right before I jumped on this webinar, was how do we continue doing this work? How do we create incentives for people doing this work when funding is so limited? And how do we make real change when funding can be limited? Find allies in your community. We have small businesses that have people who have been impacted by domestic violence. And, we always say in every person's circle, they know somebody, whether they realize it or not. And so finding some of those allies that really want to support the work that needs to be done and getting sponsorships, getting different means of funding that can be unrestricted in those different scenarios is extremely important. So we can reach out to our local car dealership and call up and say, hey, Wagner's, it's Shelby with Missouri Shores. I have this project that I really would like to bring some awareness, and I want to do a lunch and learn where we can talk to different hairstylists and have cosmetologists come in and learn what to do if they have a client come in that discloses they've been through that. And so some of that community support is kind of how to fill in that funding. On a larger level, if you would like to advocate for there to be federal funding dollars available, find your representatives is huge. Having conversations about this is what we're seeing, this is what we're working with, these are the children and the families that are impacted. Can we continue these conversations because this funding is so incredibly important? Those are also conversations that can be had because unfortunately, funding in the line of work with social services, with domestic violence shelters, any kind of non-for-profits, any of those things is always going to be a huge question mark. So look to your community, reach out and advocate for that. Do whatever you can in your power. And if you ever have any questions about that, I would highly encourage reaching out to any kind of local statewide coalitions or anybody that does lobbying in those fields for different bills that have to do with funding, and see if you can get involved in that way.
Thank you. All right, well, we're coming to the end of our time together, but I am going to be a little selfish and I'm going to ask my question. Shelby, you talked a lot about collaboration and what that looks like, especially because you serve all of the tribes, like you're in that center point. And so if you could have unlimited resources and you could collaborate with the various tribes in your state, respecting their sovereignty and their goals. But if you could collaborate on implementing one thing for maybe all or one of the reservations, what would that look like? Program, resource, anything. What would that be?
Oh, that is such a good question. There are so many things. I think that having an organization specifically for education and prevention education would be like a dream. You know, we can go out and do presentations wherever we can and try and do whatever we can as a shelter, but having specific organization that can go out and provide the education for our young people, for our elders even. Sometimes our elders don't even know. We've had 74-year-old women come to our shelter that had no idea that their entire lives they'd been in a cycle of violence because of the systematic everything that's going on. And I just think that if there was unlimited resources and we could find a way to provide that, respecting culture across the different tribes, all of those different things, that would be absolutely amazing. And I think it could really help make a difference, to anybody who needed that kind of prevention education and in those resources.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone, we are at time. We want to respect your busy schedules. Please join us tomorrow, same time, same link, and we will be able to hear from Whitney again in that focus of what community can do to continue that support. So thank you for being here. Resources and surveys will be sent out after the close of today's session. Have a great day.